The way I ended my time at Planned Parenthood was the way I started, right? Only different. So I walked into the exam room and I congratulated her on her pregnancy. And she began to cry. And I thought, just Lord, give me the strength. Give me the words. I don't know what I'm going to say here, Lord, but just help me. Don't let me fall into this, right? Protect me from this. And I opened my mouth. Can't tell you exactly what came out. I remember just telling her and sharing my own experiences as a 16-year-old mother who had gone through so much. And I shared with her how God had brought me to the other side of that and brought someone into my life that would love me and love my daughter the way we were meant to be loved. And I shared my story with her, and she stood up and she threw her arms around my neck and she said, I'm keeping my baby.
Oh, no.
I'm so glad that Ramona and others like her are laboring for the Lord in this way, by sharing the damage that can be done by the abortion industry, but also sharing how the damage can be and has been prevented through testimonies like hers. Even though Ramona went through that trial as a young woman facing an unplanned pregnancy herself, she kept her baby and was able to help that young woman choose life for her baby by sharing her story with her. It's stories like that where, even in the midst of uncertainty within an unplanned pregnancy, choosing life is the best choice, because no matter what the circumstance, God has a plan for that child. In our third and final part of this special, we take a look at another story where a young mother chose life for her child, what happened to that child, the impact that the story has had on the lives of many, and how God has brought the child's biological parents from a place of guilt to a place of grace. In our third and final part, here is the story of Deland McCullough.
He didn't start off as Deland McCullough. He came into the world named John Kenneth Briggs. I was 16 and found myself pregnant. And as I indicated prior to the interview officially starting, I'm sure I didn't want to be pregnant at 16. This was 50 years ago. Tomorrow is his birthday, actually. So 50 years ago, tomorrow, it was different. Young girls weren't as openly having babies then as they do now. So my mom found out I was pregnant, and within a couple of days, I was shipped off to a place right outside of Pittsburgh to stay there until I delivered. So I went there probably July, and he was born on December the 1st. So I spent that whole time there with a group of other pregnant girls from everywhere. You know, we were from all walks of life, from everywhere. I was just thinking about this the other day. There actually was, we were all girls, but there was one grown woman that was there. So I went to have this baby. And I don't know how much you know about the story, but Sherman didn't know that I was pregnant. He had gone off to college. He was a very big athlete at our high school, you know, very prominent athletes, you know, in multiple sports. He had gotten a scholarship to go to college, so he was gone to college already. He was going down his path, and I was going down my own path. So had the baby, named him John Kenneth, came back to school, finished school. Fast forward to 45 years later, I get a text message on my phone one evening. I get a message that says, "Did you have a baby in Allegheny County in 1972? Well, of course I did, but nobody knew. I mean, absolutely no one knew outside of my immediate family. Nobody knew. Try to get in touch with my cousin, my best cousin, to run it past her to see, should I engage in this conversation or not? Can't catch up with her. Call my niece, can't catch up with her. Call my brother, and he says, well, just slow down, Carol. He said, because, things are going on in the world, people getting catfished. It could be anything, it could be anybody. I said, well, but this is something that I really wanted to see happen. So I say, yeah, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to do it. So I respond back, yes. And he says, well, what did you name him? And I said, well, not Deland, because it's coming across on my text as Deland McCullough. I'm like, well, not Deland. So I tell him what I named him, and he says, I want to talk to you about John. Turns out he had been looking for me. He had been looking for me for a while.
Once you found out you were adopted, how long did it take you to decide that you wanted to find your birth parents? And can you share with us also a little bit about the process you went through to find your birth parents and reach out to them?
It was a long time before I decided to reach out for them. I mean, I was 30 something years old, so 28 years later or something like that. I'd always wondered, some of the features and things that I had, where did it come from? But I was like, hey, I mean, it is what it is, But my adoptive mom reached out to me not reached out to me. We were just talking, and she said something related to my adoption and talking about the lawyer that did it. So that's sparked some things again for me, because I started asking more questions then, and she revealed to me that that I was in the orphanage. I never knew that, and she talked about what the nuns, the name, what the nuns that referred to me as at the orphanage, which was Baby John, and I said I never heard that stuff before. So at that point, I started wondering about it more, and I started beginning the infancy process, in the infancy stages of finding out who my biological family is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so once some of the puzzle pieces started to connect, it really got you more curious in a sense as to.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, hey, I wanted to, it was interesting, and maybe at that point I was ready to do a little bit more, at least surface investigation, and that's what I did a few years after that conversation.
Turns out he had been looking, and at that time, adoption records were sealed. So, he was checking in Ohio. He couldn't find anything in Ohio. Somebody in Columbus said, you might want to check Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is right next to Ohio. So he checks Pennsylvania, and he says, the woman told him, I have the information that you want right in front of me, but I can't give it to you because adoption records were sealed. So it turns out that a politician in Pennsylvania was adopted also. And at the same time that Deland's looking for me, this guy is working towards getting adoption records opened. So right at the time that, this is, Deland's really ramping up his efforts to find me, adoption records are unsealed. So he gets his adoption record is how he happened to send me a Facebook message. He gets the name from the birth. It's like a birth certificate. He sees my name on there. He sees my name as the mother, no name as the father. So he goes out on Facebook to find me, of course. But he goes out on Facebook with my name and starts looking for me. And he said he found another Carol Briggs in Philadelphia, sent her the same message, didn't get any response back from her. He's looking at different people, and, he said he sees my picture, and then he looks back at his picture of him and his kids, and he says, well, she might be the one. She kind of looks like us. Mm-hmm. So that's how he happened to send me the message also, and I responded. So that was the beginning of my relationship with my son. I had not seen or heard from him anything, had no idea where he was for 45 years.
Wow. So after 45 years of not seeing your son and now finally being reconnected to him, how did that make you feel?
It was very exciting, very emotional for everybody, because now, now it's out that, I can't wait to tell people now that I've got this amazing son, because in the time from when he sent me the original text message to when we actually spoke that same evening, I'm all over the internet trying to find out information about who this guy is, Deland McCullough. And I'm like, okay, if this is a catfish situation, somebody has gone through an awful lot of trouble to fool me, because this guy is all over social media. When he contacted me, he was a running back coach at USC in California. So I said, man, they've gone through a lot of trouble to create this persona for this guy if he's not real. So but he was who he said he was. So I was really excited. The only downside then and to this day is my parents had both passed away by the time this happened. And my mother used to say, even before she got sick, my mother, every couple of years, she would say, you know, you should try to find out where that boy is. There wasn't even a Facebook at that time, but even if there was a Facebook, I mean, I didn't have any information on where to even look for him. And I saw him in person. Well, I met him when we had our conversation. It was on the 17th of November. And my family were having a Thanksgiving dinner. So we were going to have a Zoom call, a FaceTime call. So he was going to call me from California with his family. And then I was going to be in Youngstown with all of my family, his family. So we could see each other for the first time. Physically, I mean, actually see each other. We didn't physically touch each other until several weeks after that. But I got to see him face to face for the first time in 45 years. That Thanksgiving. When I finally saw him in person, he was out recruiting, and he was coming to, I don't know if he was coming to Youngstown, but he was coming in the area. So he swung through Youngstown so he could actually meet me face to face. So he came to my house. It was the first time I'd actually seen him and got my hands on him since the day after he was born.
Wow. So can you share with us, Carol, what was it like seeing your son in your house for the first time in 45 years? What was that like?
I thought sure that I would be a mess. I thought that I would cry the whole time. I did. And I'm going to cry during this too. So, but I thought I'd cry through the whole thing. But I had cried so much in those couple of weeks before that. I had cried so much about being so happy that this had finally happened, because I always wanted to just know that he was okay. You know, I mean, it wasn't necessary for me to be part of his life or for him to accept me into his life after, you know, so long, and after, you know, I had placed him for adoption. But it was important for me to know that he was okay, that he was a good person, you know, that he was doing all right. I would have been happy with that. But to actually have him want to have me in his life, it was a lot. It was a lot for me and my whole family, because like I said, nobody even knew. My cousins didn't even know. Nobody knew that I had this baby. You know, it never came out. I never told anybody because Sherman didn't know. And so the last thing I wanted was for him to hear about it through anyone other than me. But, you know, I didn't have any information to give him about where this baby was. You know, I had him and placed him for adoption, and he didn't even know that I was pregnant. So I didn't have any information to give him. And so I never, what could I tell him? So I never said anything to him or anyone. So nobody, absolutely nobody knew.
Yeah, well, that must have been, first off, that must have been a very special moment for you to reunite with your son in your own home after
Yeah.
45 years. What a
Yeah, it
special
was.
moment
It
that
was.
must have been for you. So now you finally meet Deland, your son, after 45 years. The next step, I would guess, would be to then have him reconnect with Sherman. So my question for you then would be, how did that go about once you met him, reconnecting with
Okay,
his son?
so how he reconnected with Sherman, when we have our first conversation, that evening when he sends me the text, about that I have a baby, we actually talked that evening. And we're talking, and he says, "Well, who's my dad?" And I said, "Well, your dad's name is Sherman Smith." And I could catch in his voice. And he says, "Well, I know Sherman." Turns out he had known Sherman since he was 17 years old. Sherman had recruited him from high school to go to college. He went to the same college that Sherman went to,
You're
played the
kidding.
same position in college that Sherman played.
No way.
Right. So
Wow.
a couple days after that, he says, "Well, can I tell my dad?" And I'm like, "Absolutely, you tell him." So so he texts Sherman, and Sherman will tell you how that went with him.
The way I met Deland was now I'm coaching at Miami University, in Oxford, Ohio, and Youngstown, Ohio, and the surrounding area was part of my recruiting responsibility. And this running back from Campbell Memorial High School was a guy that we looked at and we were going to recruit him, and that was Deland. And so that's the first time I met him, when I went to the school and introduced myself to him, and talked about bringing him up to school for a visit. And at that time he told me about he was adopted. Then I went and met his adopted mom, Adele, and drove them up to Miami University for a visit that weekend. And so that's where it all started, right there, with that visit right there. And we just had a relationship. We just bonded together right then. The 4.5 hour drive to campus, helped us to bond, and then the drive back. And then when he committed to come to Miami, I only coached him for 1 year because I left. And that was hard, but like I said, not knowing he was my son, but I treated him like I treated all the other guys. I treated him with respect. Once I left Miami of Ohio and I go to the University of Illinois, and then I'm coaching in the National Football League, we just maintained contact, and we just talked and maintained contact. Then life went on. He got into coaching. He came out and did an internship the year after we won the Super Bowl in Seattle. And that's when guys were looking at him and they were telling him, "Man, you and he have to be father and son." And we would laugh it off and say, "No way, why would I think he's my son?" Deland was hearing that when we were together in college at Miami of Ohio.
Wow.
His teammates would say to him, "You and Coach Sherman, man, that's your dad." And so once again, he brushed it off like, how could he be my dad? And then when I hear it, I say, "Well, no one told me that I had fathered a child. So I'm not, there's no way this is true." So we maintained a great relationship throughout that time. Carol knew that she had put a child up for adoption. Deland knew that he was looking for his biological mother and father. And when I got the call from Deland telling me that he had found his biological mom, and she said that I was his father, first of all, I was in shock, because I didn't know that I had a son out there, so I was in shock at that point. I'm glad when they told me I was sitting down and not driving a car somewhere, because it was like, it probably would have drove head on into something, but it hit me that fast, like, man, so it took me by surprise. From the standpoint of my actions, Teddy, growing up and what I was doing, I shouldn't have been surprised, but here it is, I'm 63 years old, and I'm finding out that a young man that I knew, that I recruited when he was in high school, that I maintained a relationship with, a guy that I love and respect, that he was my son. It brought back the fulfillment of the words when I would say to guys, "You may not be looking for a father, but I'm going to treat you like you're my son." And so I, in fact, was coaching my son and didn't know that.
It took you a while, as you had mentioned, to really make the effort to find your birth parents and to reach out to them, almost 30 years. But in that 30-year time frame, you actually did meet your biological father, but you didn't necessarily know he was your biological father, and that would be Sherman Smith. Share with us your relationship with him at that time, not knowing he was your biological father.
Yeah, well, my senior year, it might have been like November. He came to the school. That was my first time, ever meeting Coach Smith at the time. I got called down to the office, and there he was. He was standing there, and good looking guy, well spoken, educated. He was playing the NFL. So a lot of those traits I hadn't really seen at people walking around my neighborhood, as far as that level of success and different things like that. So that's where the connection started. He came up. He was running back coach for Miami University, and they were attempting to recruit me. So that's where everything started from, and it just grew from there. Obviously, I went to the school. Had obviously a phenomenal connection with him, and maintained that connection for the next several decades.
Did it ever cross your mind maybe that he could have been your biological father just based on the look? Because, when I spoke to your dad, he was telling me that some people, and even Carol was telling me too, that some people would say, you guys have to be father and son. Like, there's just so much of a connection and, resemblance in a way. So did that ever cross your mind before you found out?
No, I never thought, wow, Coach Smith might be my dad. No, there's nothing made me think that. I mean, we just heard, when I was in college, people, a lot of people made that comment, and I just kind of laughed it off. And then even several years later, I did an internship for the Seattle Seahawks in 2014, and the coaching staff and people there made the comment. There was nothing to make me think that, because number one, I had no idea who my mom was, no idea where I was born. I never narrowed it down and say Coach Sherman Smith might be my dad.
When you found out he was your biological father, what was your initial reaction to that? What was going through your mind at that time?
I was pretty excited. I mean, a lot of things made sense. I mean, I felt really blessed that the connection we had. Come to find out, it was more than just player and coach. That there was something beyond that. Because the first time I met him, I mean, immediately I felt connected to him. Like instantly. I coach, I recruit, I make connections with guys right now too. But I just felt like it was a little bit more than that. But you don't know what that is. So I mean, I was excited, I was relieved. I felt, like I said, really blessed. Like, wow, this, because I knew who he was and I knew the type of person he was. So that was strong for me, and knowing, wow, this is my dad.
Everything was going really well with Deland's reunion with his parents, Carol and Sherman. But one thing Carol was still really nervous about, talking to Sherman about their son Deland after all these years.
Then Deland texts me back and he says, well, my dad wants to talk to you. Now, how I thought that I could get through this and not actually have to talk to Sherman, because I hadn't spoken to Sherman in 45 years either. So he says, well, my dad wants to talk to you. Okay. So he's going to call me the next day at work. And I cried the entire morning at work waiting for this phone call. I cried the whole morning because, once you talk to Sherman, you'll find he is a man of strong faith. I said, but that won't stop him from cussing me out. That won't stop him from cussing me out once he talks to me about this situation. I said, this is a powerful situation. Things could get away from him. But we had a beautiful conversation. We talked about everything because we knew each other from high school. He lived three houses down the street from my aunt. We all went to the same high school. We all knew all the same people. So we talked about everything before we talked about Deland. So, we had a beautiful conversation about that. He tells me that, and I still feel bad about this, but he says that he felt that he had not held up his responsibility because I had to go through that by myself. I told him, I said, you didn't even know. If you had known and not been involved, that would have been a whole different situation. You didn't even know. So that part of how that affects him, it still kind of bothers me about that.
I think the first part, Teddy, when I heard, I really felt bad about it. I really did. I wasn't feeling bad about Deland being my son. I felt bad about my irresponsibility. I felt bad that he didn't have what I had growing up. My father was my hero. My dad was my guy. And then I think with my kids, Sherman and Siobhan, that I had, through my marriage with Sharon, I would hope that they would say that I had an impact in their life. So I knew that I was responsible for Deland not having what I had. And I really felt bad about that. I had a lot of guilt about that. And I had to get through that. I think that's the hardest part I had to get through. I wasn't concerned about what other people had to say other than my wife and my 2 kids. But other than that, it was just the guilt of, man alive, my irresponsibility put this young man in a situation that, I didn't have to experience, and I wish he didn't have to experience. So when he called me, Teddy, to tell me the news, he said, hey, if you are my father, great. We'll build on our relationship. He said, if you aren't my father, that's great too. We already have a relationship. So we knew we had a relationship one way or another. And so, but it was great. The thing that I loved about it, he called me, he said, I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad about anything. He said, I don't want anything from you, but I just, if you're my dad, I just want us to build on our relationship. And I said, absolutely. If that's the case, that's what we'll do.
My concern in all this now, okay, it's all out. He's got a wife, he's got kids, he's got grandkids. My concern now is I don't want them to think anything differently about him. I don't want them to feel anything differently about him because of this. This happened, we were kids. I was 16, he was 17, 18. We were kids, we were children. But I didn't want this to have any impact on his family and the dynamic that was between him and his wife and his children, his grandchildren. I didn't want them to look at him and still see the same man that they saw this time yesterday before he knew any of this.
I can imagine, once a big, I guess, long lost secret, let's call it, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
I can imagine that's probably not the easiest thing to deal with after it being, hidden for 45
secret
years.
for so long, right?
Yes. So
Right.
you and Sherman now are both strong in your faith in the Lord. And, but back then, it was a different time. There must have been different circumstances. You may not have been walking with the Lord. But the point is that you guys ended up having this child at a young age, and it was unplanned. When you were 16 years old, what was going through your mind at the time? Did you ever consider getting an abortion at the time?
No, and I won't say that was because I was pro-life. I mean, I was 16. I don't think I had any conception of pro-life or pro-choice at the time. My decision was based solely on the fact that I was a child. I was 16. My mother was still cooking for me, still washing my clothes, still cleaning my bedroom up once a week for me. I was in no position to be anybody's mother. And I knew that. So that was the driving force behind my decision to do what I did and place him for adoption. I knew that there were people out there that wanted children, that couldn't have children. At the time, I wasn't one of them that wanted to have a baby. I was 16. I didn't want to have a baby, but I knew that there were people that did want to have children. So it really wasn't a difficult decision. And I never once regretted my decision. At no point in the last 50 years now that I ever look back and say, wow, I wish I had done something different, about him, kept him myself, or, I never once regretted the decision I made. I knew I made the decision for the right reason, and that was for him to be able to have a family of his own, a mom, a dad, fully engaged parents. But, I couldn't do anything for him because I was still being taken care of myself. So I couldn't take care of him. So I wanted him to have the opportunity to have what I had.
Decide keeping it for yourself, you had two options, which were abortion or adoption. And, some people in your case maybe would have done the abortion so they wouldn't even have to worry about what happened to the baby
Whatever
afterwards.
happens, right.
But correct me if I'm wrong, you chose adoption because, for one, you did not want to rob your son of the life he could have. And you wanted to bless somebody else with the opportunity to raise him, maybe in case the opportunity didn't present itself for them to have their own child to raise.
Right.
Based off of your life experience and you now reconnecting with Deland, what would you say to a young 16-year-old girl who is facing and dealing with an unplanned pregnancy? What advice would you give her to make the decision for life?
I think that I would say, don't be so quick to make the obvious choice for her. It turns out that my son is such an amazing person. He has made such an impact in so many young men's lives, including my 4 grandchildren, my 4 grandsons. The world needed to have him. He needed to be a part of this world.
I read so many stories about different people who, they were the child of a parent of an unplanned pregnancy. I think of people like Steve Jobs. His parents, they were going to abort him and they kept him, and look what he's done. He's created one of the biggest companies in the world. You look at a recent story like Steph Curry with his family. Sonia Curry, she just recently came out and opened up how she was considering having an abortion, almost did, but she kept Steph. Look at the impact that someone like Steph Curry has had on the world.
Right.
And just knowing those stories and now talking about your story with Deland, you're absolutely right. Just seeing the impact he has on those around him. The world needs these babies.
Every person comes into this world with a gift. That's something that you're good at. And you may figure out what your gift is when you're 5 years old. Or you may not figure out what your gift is until you're 50. But there's something that everyone comes into this world with that is a gift to the world. It may not be as big as Steve Jobs, but there's value in what your life brings to the world.
That's why I just have so much respect for Carol today, the decision that she made. And she was trying to do what was best for Deland. And she was thinking about myself. She was thinking about herself. Hey, what is best for Deland in this situation? And she absolutely made the right choice. No question about it.
Amen. No question about it. And we're very glad that she did make that decision. So,
Me too.
what would you say to a young man who has an unplanned pregnancy? He's gotten his girl pregnant and he wasn't expecting to, and now abortion's crossing his mind. What would you say to that man who's in this situation?
Well, I kind of had the same situation with Eddie George his rookie year when we were together with the Houston Oilers at that time. And he found out that his girlfriend was pregnant. So man, I mean, he left training camp. He was all messed up. And I said to him at that time, once again, not knowing that I had fathered a child, and I said, man, having a child is a beautiful thing, and you own up to your responsibility and you be a man. You just be in this child's life and not just be a paycheck. You be in this child's life and man up. So that's what I said to him, and he didn't tell me at that time if they were considering abortion or not. He just knew that his girlfriend was pregnant and he wasn't ready to be a father. And so he responded that way. So that's what I would say to a guy. If he said, I'm considering abortion, I said, that's a bad plan. You need to man up, be responsible. You give this child a chance to live. There's a such thing. There are accidental parents, but we know as believers, there's no such thing as an accidental child.
Amen.
When God says, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. I set you apart before you were born, So when I know that God knows that this child, so, hey, you might have been a parent by accident, but this child is planned by God. And so I would encourage him to go, you got to man up.
You're right. There's the impact that one child can make, the child that God has planned this life for.
That's right.
By the way, whatever happened with that situation with Eddie? Did he decide to keep the child? Or
yeah, they had the child. They had the child. She had the child. And I laughed because the guy, he looks just like Eddie, And so right now he just finished up college, at Vanderbilt. and you know, doing great. And Eddie, that's his guy, man. They have a great relationship, and you know, and he embraced it when he got his head together, and he embraced it from the beginning. You know, right from the beginning, Teddy. He didn't shy away from it. He wasn't just sending a paycheck. He was spending time with his son, and they have a great relationship today.
Even though you're in a situation at the time that's uncomfortable, like saying an unplanned pregnancy, you know, really I think the lesson to learn here is taking accountability. You know, yeah, okay, you may have made a mistake. You did something you were not supposed to do, and you should have saved yourself until marriage. But, you know, given that, now you have to, you know, take accountability for the situation at hand. And, you know, when you own up to it and just say, you know what, this is my doing, I have to take accountability for it. This child should not be punished as a result. Look at the blessings that can cultivate, you know, not only in your life with your son Deland, but with Eddie and his son as well.
And even like in my story with Deland, it just shows what God can do. God can take a mess and make a miracle out of it. And two wrongs don't make a right. So here it is, I get somebody pregnant, and then, you know, okay, well, let me compound that by, now let's go get an abortion, you know, and so I just think, you know, two wrongs don't make a right.
Really, that's just a testimony of God's sovereignty in this situation where, you know, he enabled you to make that decision. And now Deland is, you know, living I would say a successful life, and just the impact that has, you know, in his testimony to others. That's just really, really powerful, how God's sovereignty comes into play.
I think that the greatest testimony of my story is through the process of him finding me after all these years, because that's where we've gotten our greatest input from when the story first came out. You know, ESPN made a documentary about our story. When that got released, our greatest input from people was, wow, this gives me hope that I can find my birth parents, or, you know, I can find my child that I placed for adoption. So I think the greatest testimony from the story is that, you know, never to give up, you know, always have faith that it can happen. Because I mean, I always hoped that it would happen. I always hoped that it would happen. But that's what our greatest impact has been from the story, in that for people not to give up. What everyone says when the story first came out, a common thread through almost all the comments was, it's a God thing. Because there were so many moving parts in our journeys, all of us, that had to come perfectly together for us to be where we are today. You know, Sherman came and met Deland when he was 17 years old at high school, recruited him to go to the same college he went to. He broke his dad's running back records at Miami of Ohio. All these things were happening. You know, he was following the same path that Sherman followed in his career. And all this time, neither of them knew that they were father and son. Everyone said that it's a God thing. It's a God thing. That's been the common theme. It's a God thing. That, like, and I always say, there's just too many moving parts for any of us to have really played a part in making this happen. You know, nobody but God could have brought us all together like this.
Just excited. This situation worked out great. A bunch of people who've been touched by this story, who I see all the time and run into all the time, even while I'm out doing my job and recruiting, and people say, hey, you're the guy from that story, and they'll talk about how they're adopted. You know, so many people who my story resonates with them because they're adoptees.
It's just been great. It really has worked out amazingly well. Amazingly well.
Amen. Absolutely, yes. The one thing that we can 100% take away from your story, Carol, is that God's hand was 100% on this situation, and
Absolutely.
It couldn't have happened without him. So praise the Lord. Praise the Lord for that.
That's what I've always encouraged my kids and other kids. I would ask them, do you want God's best for your life? Their answer is always yes. And then my response is, then do it God's way. If you want God's best, you got to do it God's way. And God's way isn't always the easiest, but it's the best way. Back in the 80s, Nancy Reagan there was that slogan, just say no to drugs. Just say no to drugs. And it just didn't work. And the thing that we're finding out is that I tell people, you have to say yes before you say no. It's what you're saying yes to that gives you the motivation and the power to say no. So if I've said yes to the will of God, then it's easier for me to say no to those things that aren't the will of God. But it starts out with my yes to God. I love it how God says, he said, I'm not going to be mocked. You're going to reap what you sow, and so that's a promise. And I just think we've all experienced God's grace and mercy in our lives, because Romans 3:23, for all the sin that falls short of the glory of God. So we've all messed up in some way or another. But I just believe in the grace of God and the will of God, and how, God can hit a bullseye with a crooked stick, with a crooked arrow. And so God he can take our faults and he can still turn them into good. Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. On our best day, we're never out of the need of God's grace. And on our worst day, we're not out of the reach of God's grace. So man, no matter how bad it is, God's grace is sufficient. God's grace can bring us through, in ways that we never thought he could deliver us.
Amen. Yeah, and I think of 2 Corinthians 12:9 for, when Jesus says, "For my grace is sufficient for thee, and that my strength is made perfect in weakness."
That's it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen. That's right, Teddy. Our family has been enriched with, knowing that Deland is my son, and we were blessed with 4 more grandsons that I have. Man, they've been a great blessing. I'm really happy for Carol because, she had no other kids after Deland, and for her to be able to see the fulfillment of a dream and wish and desire that she had, this young man would come back into her life. And so I'm excited for her. And just to see that God he can take a mess and make a miracle out of it, and a ministry and a message. How this story has encouraged so many men and people across the country, as I've had opportunities to go and speak, to hear guys talking about how they're encouraged to pursue a relationship, to pursue their adoptive parents, their biological parents, and just all kind of, God has used this in so many different ways. It's blown my mind. What I did, I told my 4 grandsons, and all my grandkids, and even that some of them were not young enough, they're too young to understand it. But I told them, even though this story has a great ending, don't do it this way. Even though, man, this is a beautiful story, man, and family come together and we find our son and got these 4 great grandsons, and, great grandkids. I said, don't do it this way. Do it God's way. Don't do it this way. So I encourage, even though this story has a great ending, I encourage people still, it's best to do it God's way.